Hello, my name is Maheen Adamson, and I'm here to talk to you about sex differences in traumatic brain injury patients. I'm currently at the VA Palo Alto Healthcare System as well as Stanford School of Medicine in the Department of Neurosurgery. As you can see on the screen, you can go to my website that's on the screen, adamsonlab.stanford.edu. For today is to talk about the problem, which is the lack of data that is for women in brain injury, traumatic brain injury, and how we can address that. We will also talk about sex differences in what is called cortical thickness, which is a measure that you do in on the brain. And you also will talk about sex differences in other factors of brain structure, which is for diffusion properties. And we will also have a summary and discuss some data at the end. Thing that's really important to understand is that sex differences in the brain are based in animal studies. Most of the research that was done earlier, only in animal studies, looked at 99% male species. You can see the difference between the two brains. On the left hand side, you have a rat brain, which is about 71 million neurons, and on the right side, you see a human brain, which is about 86 billion neurons with 16 billion in just the cerebral cortex. You can see that in order for us to really map what we find in the animal studies to the human brain is very difficult because of the different, obviously, the size and the way our brain is structured with a huge amount of neurons. And also, if the studies in animal are mostly on males, it's difficult to it's easy to miss the nuances that are that exist in the female brain. So you can be sure that there are some structural differences that may be caused by hormones, may be caused by the genetic differences in how men and women are made, and may also have some epigenetic or environmental factors. Main differences are inherently the genetic X and Y chromosome. I know all of you know about that. And X chromosome is about 1,500 genes, and Y chromosome is only 27 genes. You can see some of the graphics on the side that look at the human brain with some very, very important organs that are marked. And you see a little excerpt that I got from another study that looks at it's a publication that was done in a scientific magazine that was more for everyday readers. A new way of showing the connectivity of the brain that's called the connectome and how it differs between male and female. Well, the total brain size is bigger in men. We know that. A hippocampus is bigger in women. That has been shown and it's used in memory. Amygdala, the left is bigger in women and right is bigger in men. There are some behavioral or performance differences in which that show that women respond more to emotionally disturbing content, how they exhibit their response. They are more vivid, they're more intense, and the emotional center is bigger on the left-hand side. The two hemispheres of a woman's brain, they talk to each other more than a man's brain. And you can see that on the little graphic on the right-hand side that looks at male versus female brain. So there's some research, although it can be contested by other researchers, that there is more connection between the two hemispheres in women than there is in men. Another excerpt from Northwestern Medicine, something that talks about sex and disease characteristics between male and female brain. Male brain is about 10% larger than the female brain. Female brain is about stronger side-to-side connections. Male brain has stronger front-to-back connections, and the female brain is optimized for intuitive thinking. It has more gray matter. Male brain is optimized for motor skills. These are studies that have shown this, but there are other studies that deny that this exists, and they focus more on things that are more environmental, and so it's the old nature versus nurture argument. When you look at differences in the brain, and there are some that exist, what does that do to health impact? Well, there's more likely to develop alcohol dependence in males, 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. four times more likely to have autism, twice as likely to develop Parkinson's. Such health impacts in women are twice as likely to have depression, twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease, four times more likely to develop multiple sclerosis, and more likely to have a stroke. As you can see, I study women in the military. I work at the VA Palo Alto, and it's important to note that women veterans have increased overall and they are now 1.8 million, which is 8% of all living veterans. So you can see the projection from 2000 to 2014, experiencing more combat than previous eras. There's about 250,000 women that were deployed, which is 12% of total deployed. Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom, women were more likely to obtain VA healthcare than previous women vets. And they have some very unique readjustment and stressors, such as military mothers are three times more likely to be single. And there's also harassment, sexual trauma, and assault. Military women, particularly with traumatic brain injury, tend to fare worse than men for psychiatric and neurobehavioral symptoms after traumatic injury. So these women who went to Iraq and Afghanistan after post 911, post 9/11, were seen at the VA 11% screened positive for traumatic brain injury compared to 23% of men. Women with traumatic brain injury are more likely to be diagnosed twice as much for depression, 1.3 times more with anxiety disorder than PTSD, and 1.5 times for PTSD and depression, so comorbidity together, two diseases. Impact of traumatic brain injury is largely unknown, that is in women. Findings from VA retrospective cohort that we have done ourselves in comparative analysis of our own databases because we see a lot of women. Community V integration is lower percentage of women with TBI working, 19% versus 62% TBI population. More homelessness among the women with TBI, 11% worse versus 2% traumatic brain injury population. Women are diagnosed more often with depression, PTSD, anxiety, substance abuse, cognitive disorders, and impairment, which has a huge impact on dementia. And it's likely that women are 80% more likely to have two diagnoses at once. Women report chronic pain, 85%, chronic headaches, 42%, sleep disturbances, 89%, and neurological problems. And women suffer more severe somatosensory and vestibular symptoms, which is, vertigo and problems like that. We have been publishing in this area, traumatic brain injury in female veterans and sex and gender differences in traumatic brain injury as far back as 2017 and 2018. So we did a particularly with this paper in neurosurgical focus in which we looked at traumatic brain injury among female veterans, and it confirmed the findings that I just went through with you on the group. So that was because we were looking at symptoms, but what you also see is that in treatment modulation, so when you provide treatments to women, particularly something that has to do with magnetic stimulation to the brain, you also see a lot of differences in how treatment is offered to women veterans versus men veterans. So depression is common in post-traumatic brain injury and TBI disorder. So when you associate transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a way to FDA approved to reduce depression, we did a scoping review in 2020 to look at how this treatment is offered to women versus men and what is reported when in studies that have done these kind of treatments. What we find is that you have precision rehabilitation medicine is really needed. So the women experience worse post-TBI outcomes than men due to sex differences in metabolism, cortical thickness, and societal factors. So cortical thickness is a measure you do of the brain, and we will talk about that particular study because it's our study. Neuromodulation is something called that is another way of modulating the activity in the brain, which is the use of the magnet that I just showed you, transcranial magnetic stimulation. Some of you may know what DBS is, which is deep brain stimulation, when you actually insert an electrode inside the brain. And there's also transcranial electrical stimulation, PES. All of these are used for treatment of depression and other symptoms, but the treatment is very different is looked at differently. The access of the treatment for women, for veterans versus male veterans, and also the outcomes are different, and also the way it's reported is different. And it does show promising results, but there's very little that is known about sex differences in this kind of treatment. We've published quite a bit since then. Since 2018 in brain injury, we've looked at cortical thickness differences and diffusion properties, and that's the data that I'm going to show you. We've also presented on preliminary investigation of sex differences in procedural skill learning in veterans. We've also done sex differences in neuromodulation, brain stimulation treatment approaches for traumatic brain injury as a review. In this experiment, which is actually published, we looked at participants that were both TBI and controls, and they're divided in this as females and males. So people who had traumatic brain injury versus people who didn't. And we measured it on the left-hand side by looking at, we compared them on age, education, we looked at time since injury, how long it's been since your brain went through traumatic brain injury. We looked at the number of traumatic brain injuries that they had. We looked at their other scores that relate to symptoms, reported symptoms, as well as PTSD checklist. And we provided this and we compared it to compared them across between traumatic brain injury and controls. Notice we tried to match them on age, and we also tried to match them on education, and that was what we did. And you can see that their scores for PTSD are lower than the ones who had traumatic brain injury, and the traumatic brain injury scores are higher than the ones who were controlled, and that makes sense. A really short slide that shows that we did a 3T GE MRI scanner, and this is the sequence that was done. One was to look at the actual structure of the brain. The other was to look at how water flows through the brain and how diffusion happens through the white matter tracts. You are getting a lot of lessons in this, and you've seen a lot of images and neuroimaging, and I want to show you what cortical thickness looks like. Cortical thickness is a measure that has been used for a while to look at the thickness of the cortex, which is just a few millimeters, and we want to be able to see whether there's any difference between men and women before and after. I mean, basically between controlled participants and patients with traumatic brain injury. I didn't have the pre-morbid or what's called before the injury MRI. This is a cross-sectional study, and I'm comparing traumatic brain injury patients with control. So within that, I'm also comparing males and females. There's a lot of statistics here, but the idea is to show you that we can represent the statistics on top of a model brain with these lighted areas. What you see in this next slide is that we compared whether the cortex was thin versus whether the cortex was thick. Usually, and I will explain this to you in the next slide, that usually men and women are different in cortical thickness. Women usually have 11% thicker cortex. What we found in the group difference is that men after brain injury had the same amount of cortex in the sense that they were still, the same as literature shows and controls show to be. So women after brain injury were not 11% higher than males. They were actually much lower, and that interpreted and was published that we actually were not able to show that women actually reached their original literature cited control cortical thickness. They were actually less, so they didn't recover as much after brain injury as males. In terms of the white matter tract and how the water flows through the brain. And in terms of the white matter tracks, that's called a diffusion tensor imaging. And that means that we can map the flow of the water in all the major fibers of the brain by looking at a template, an atlas, which was created by Mori et al. In 2008. And we look at 18 major fibers and two that cross between the hemispheres. So we are able to do imaging to find out how this diffusion pattern changes after traumatic pain. Our finding, and the reason I left this here is just to show you, that it is important to keep in mind that when you look at journal articles and you look at papers, what ends up happening is that you see all these tables and you don't understand what is going on. But here, what you show is group differences in what's called fractional anisotropy and mean diffusion. These are just measures that you get from imaging that tell you how your white matter fiber tracks are showing the difference. So these are measures of the diffusion of water. What we see here is the fiber tracks that I just showed you on the template. They're on the left-hand side, and we divide those metrics, FA and MD, into left-hand side of the brain and right-hand side of the brain, and we divide them also by the females and males. What you see here in bold is the difference in females and males, and on first sight, what you see is there's more of a difference compared to controls. In females with traumatic brain injury, you see more bold blue than you see the light blue on the male side. More difference in the females between females that were controlled versus those that were TBI. That means 11% higher when you don't have traumatic brain injury. But when you have traumatic brain injury, it actually goes down. The difference is not that big. So that's what we are looking for. These are all corrected for statistical comparison. Conclusions are that there's greater cortical thickness to start with for females, but there's also greater cortical thinning for females who have traumatic brain injury. We didn't see that many significant sex differences in the measures of FA and MD, even though you saw those bold measures. And I wanted to leave that there for you to understand a little bit about the statistical analysis. Some differences can show up, but you have to correct them for the number of times you did the test and the number of times and the number of fibers that you're doing. Once you correct for that, those differences go away. So in the end, there are no significant differences in FAM. Both female and male traumatic brain injury patients have significant fractional anisotropy reduction. Yes, both of them do because they've had traumatic brain injury. And what is important also is that male traumatic brain injury have fiber tracks with significant correlations with what's called trail making test, which is a verbal memory test. And those fiber tracks are more, and those, so there's correlation between the diffusion measures of FA and MD and verbal memory test, which is trail making B. So in traumatic brain injury, those two things have more correlations. We don't know, in fact, what that means, but we know that we need data from before in order to build. Because we work with women in the military, there are recommendations that have been made to us by DoD as the Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs that tell us that you have to pay attention to whether outcomes of TBI depend on severity, number of injuries, sex, and ethnicity, because ethnic and racial aspects do play into what's called social determinants of health, and they may also, the income level may also play a difference. Environmental hazards that push you more towards having traumatic brain injury, especially also when you are playing football and things like that. Examine issues related to women's circumstances and stressors, workplace sexual harassment and assault, PTSD, military trauma. And one of the things that has been recommended to us is that we must oversample female populations and develop policy to eliminate military sexual trauma, which is called MST, due to associations with poor readjustment when returning home. Productions that we are really looking forward to is findings that have major implications for developing targeted rehabilitation strategies and innovative treatment studies. So, when you diagnose and you do studies on what the differences are, you can use them as targets to create better treatment options. So, you can look at things like cortical thickness and then figure out how, and diffusion properties, figure out if they make a good target for treatments, and you can look specifically for women and men differences. So, a comprehensive model that incorporates measures from functional and reintegration indices, brain structure, neuropsychological function, biomarkers, and psychiatric diagnosis needs to be developed in order to provide precision medicine for women. One thing that I need you to understand is that always question a paper when they're talking about genetic injury. Look at the table one, look at what the demographics are, the age and education, but most importantly, also look at how many women are included in the sample and whether the paper actually recommends treatments or diagnoses that are relevant not just to men but also to women. I recommend that you visit my lab and online and contact me if you need to have any questions. And thank you very much.